Prepare o heart para que da história o esperando na de estar principalmente o vasto acesso a uma desvante a deixar para o pintenépero. Dos seres humanos, desetapor toda a stoite de together dos identes e campo de uma altando aos automacan fall, a vai trotir de pierce. The story begins having do for the fast words on dope cabamai em cima na luta pifavia mount, se pipo da tu persine budamorateco, se teguinha de ginoneir, pover antemuab, sabe bom tu não se coca, a chumir zambavai, o seu dito príncipe de caro, o descava do Belém de Chabra, aqui sua boa fajetino, errante da bundoma deu bin vai sobre entre tu vai cude que tu de pelo meu pia, escava prestou de começa before the pistol var. Da você vai per, listorne que fa que valeu tá você tá predene dentro do teu pelo que liar, é que deve se torastico, supre for predene tu fora já para que nos torde, aquele imaginato que prestou per squad, today, you will walk with me through the complete narrative of the Old Testament, following every step, every tear, every promise, and every answer from God amid human limitations. In the beginning, there was nothing but God. There was no past, because nothing had happened. There was no future, because nothing was yet to come. And then, in the absolute silence, he decided to speak. The voice that created everything tore through the void, and the universe awoke. Let there be light, and light existed. With that phrase, the stage of human story began to be built. Darkness was divided. Chaos began to take shape. The Creator separated the heavens, and the seas, raised mountains, scattered stars, as if sowing seeds across the sky, shaped continents, and formed rivers that snaked through the newborn earth. And when everything was ready, when the stage of existence was set and illuminated, God decided to create his masterpieces. He formed man with his own hands. From dust, he molded something that would bear his image, and then quanta breath, a simple breath, he turned inert matter into a living being. Adam breathed for the first time, and the world was never the same. Then God formed Eve, creating not just to a people, the semat human connection, and he placed them in Eden, a perfect garden, where God was not a distant concept, but a presence that could be felt, heard, and experienced. There, everything was harmony, everything flowed with perfection. There was no pain, no death, no fear, until a serpent whispered a seed of doubt, a voice that offered the promise of autonomy, absolute independence, a false power. You will be like God, and for the first time, humanity absolutely chose a lie instead of the truth. The forbidden fruit was bitten, and in that instant, something broke. Sin entered, innocence fell, humanity was separated from God. Adam and Eve were expelled from Eden, not out of cruelty but no corrupted. They could no longer touch perfection without further destroying what was already broken. God placed cherubim at the entrance of the garden, and so began the story outside paradise. The earth that once obeyed easily now resisted. Life that had once been eternal now had an end, and pain, sweat, suffering, and death became part of the human journey. But even in that moment, God made a promise. One day someone would be born who would crush the serpent's head. Evil would be defeated. The rupture would be restored. Adam and Eve were our children, and so the world saw the terrible consequence of a sort, wounded by sin. Cain and Abel grew up learning about God. But while Shaw had caught his best, Cain offered only the minimum. Jealousy ignited, and the spark became violence. Cain killed his brother, the first shedding of human blood. And God said, "Your brother's blood cries out from the ground." Sin now had a name, a face, a story. Humanity spread, cities rose, knowledge advanced, but evil grew even faster. Violence filled the earth, and the Bible summarizes the era with a striking declaration. The wickedness of man had become great, and every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The Creator saw the world he had made swallowed by chaos, and made an unprecedented decision to start again. But before that, he found one man who was different, a man who walked out. His name was Noah. God gave Noah a plan that seemed impossible. Build a gigantic ark in a world that he had never seen rain. For decades, Noah hammered, sawed, and built while neighbors mocked, ridiculed, pointed, and laughed. Then the day came. The fountains of the deep burst forth, and the world returned to its primordial chaos. Water, noise, destruction. The ark floated as everything disappeared beneath the waters. Months later, a dove returned with an olive leaf, and when the ark rested on Mount Ararat, a new chapter began. God made a covenant with Noah, and placed a rainbow in the sky, as a sign of his promise, never again to destroy the earth with a flood. Generations multiplied again, and over time humanity filled itself with pride once more. United by one language, they decided to build a tower that reached the heavens, not to honor God, but to exalt themselves. The Tower of Babel rose as a symbol of human arrogance, but God confused their languages. What had been unity became disorder. People scattered across the earth, and the tower remained as a reminder that no human can take God's place. Then the narrative shifts. From crowds, God looks to a single man, Abram. He lived in Ur of the Chaldeans. When he heard heard God say, "Leave your land, your relatives, and go to the land I will show you." With that command, the story of an entire nation began. God promised Abram that he would make him a great nation, that his name would be renowned, and that through him all families of the earth would be blessed. But there was a detail. Abram and his wife Sarah were barren. The promise seemed impossible, yet Abram believed. He walked exactly where God led him. Years passed. The promise seemed delayed, and in a moment of impatience, Sarah offered her servant Hagar to bear a child. Ishmael was born, but God said, "The promise will come through another son." And then when Abram was 100 years old and Sarah 90, the laughter of the promise echoed within the tent. Isaac was born, but the greatest test was yet to come. God asked Abram for something unimaginable, to sacrifice Isaac, the long-awaited son, the beloved son, the boy who carried the future of the promise. Abram walked up the mountain, prepared the altar, tied his son, and just as he lifted the knife, God intervened. "Now I know that you fear God." A ram appeared caught by its horns, and Isaac was spared. The promise continued. Isaac grew, married Rebekah, and had 2 sons, Esau and Jacob. Their struggle began in the womb and continued through life. Esau was the firstborn, but one day, driven by hunger, he traded his birthright for a bowl of lentils. Later, deceived by Jacob and Rebekah, Isaac gave the blessing to the younger son. Esau vowed to kill him, and Jacob fled. On the way, sleeping with a stone for a pillow, Jacob had an extraordinary dream, a ladder connecting heaven and earth, angels ascending and descending, and God renewing his promise. Jacob continued his journey, worked for his uncle Laban, fell in love with Rachel, but was tricked into marrying Leah first. He worked 7 more years for Rachel. Amid rivalry, emotions, and years of struggle, Jacob fathered 12 sons, the future leaders of the tribes of Israel. One day, returning home, Jacob wrestled with an angel all night long. He fought until dawn. In the end, he received a new name, Israel, and he limped forever as a reminder of this supernatural night. Among Jacob's sons, one stood out, Joseph, loved by his father, hated by his brothers, sold as a slave, taken to Egypt, falsely accused, imprisoned, yet always sustained by the hand of God. Joseph interpreted dreams and eventually became governor of Egypt. When famine struck the world, his brothers came seeking help, unaware that the man before them was Joseph. After tears, tension, and reconciliation, Joseph embraced them and said, "You intended evil against me, but God turned it for good." Years passed. Israel's family grew so large that when a new pharaoh rose to power, he feared them and enslaved them. And so the stage was set for one of history's greatest deliverers, Moses. Born under Pharaoh's decree of death, placed in a basket, found by Pharaoh's daughter, raised as a prince. As an adult, after killing an Egyptian who mistreated a Hebrew, he fled into the desert. There, before a burning bush, God called him, "Go and deliver my people." Thus began the battle between the Creator and Pharaoh. Plague after plague struck Egypt until the death of the firstborns broke Pharaoh's pride. Israel left Egypt, and at the Red Sea, God opened an impossible path. In the wilderness, God fed the people with manna, brought water from the rock, and guided them with a pillar of fire and cloud. At Sinai, he gave his law and established a covenant. At the entrance of the promised land, they sent spies, then returned in fear. Only 2, Joshua and Caleb, believed. Because of the unbelief of the majority, God condemned them to wander 40 years in the desert. An entire generation died without seeing the promise. When Moses died, Joshua led the nation. He crossed the Jordan, watched the walls of Jericho fall, conquered cities, and distributed the land. But after his death, the darkest era in Israel's history began, the era of the judges. It was a period marked by a destructive cycle. The people turned away from God, fell into oppression, cried for help, and God raised a deliverer. Once freed, they fell again. This repeated for centuries. Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, Samson. Each judge rose in a time of decline and revealed both God's mercy and his patience toward a stubborn people. The Bible describes the period with a painful phrase: everyone did what was right in their own eyes. When the period of the Judges comes to an end, Israel is in crisis. De aumento de tonto de som na moral caosa tu não quem some dissolves in the moral chaos. Você te comando perticame. O do mansep de Joes dissolves in the moral chaos. Agora de pintar compa de tu homem cari, vejamos salve-me para a história do cenário. Tadeu de um amaste, me completely diferente de volante referente. Vou juve mais e picodão de palmeiras raras. E gata John seu mais declator do cenário. Para ser completely diferente dos violentos atmosfero até que la porvo. Gesta de pico virua, de padre suarte cordilado. De história do merra não faca, mão na faca, mo solvo meu partido. Mas é o estagiônio da cenário, de todo turta do pin que lava se printo do namoração parte torta sobre compressão que é. O frele chibron de grengas. Voje mas emiro de um monte amarcis Zelta no Lamara. O teu palmel do sabão de Mendos e clones a crescia. Tenente a plesenha a noite calmas o tranquem pantes teneborable. Zemos eu ama-vos contori. Zemos eu ama-vos crise tum pongas e popenicheron sumaque so prefsutia. Zemos eu ama-vos crison fagijopore. Zemos eu ama-vos crison prinda bara na flick de terfo woman. O porto mais a jubricanarigin. Zemos eu ama-vos crison fadisemari. Abaretu para sedalme na fotos explodidos. Aprico mais a bounds e se ficou packet também frames. Zemo de tubo de piro. Pakima gram goti shibane safakun sakrame sobre de turval de 5 km rumpanesu ocrido. Grave serving in the temple. Listening to the voice the many no longer heard. Zemo jubor santo. Segundo para brilhe suscitomes. E tubon da pathonente. Avatidon da naviseia. Também vespinho decently. Também no longer heard. Dois stoja tercenalmes. História do perachianum de disfortia do chaprabrisanara. Zemos eu ama-vos crison fadi semprikel. Zemos eu ama-vos crison fadi sempriando. Listening to the voice the many no longer heard. Obru perfadishamot de vubisome so mordicin somoerwa. Belginal zenvers. And on a quiet night, when silence filled the sanctuary, Samuel heard his name being called. He thought it was the priest Eli, but when he heard it again, he understood it was God. And there in that gentle call began the life of the man who would become the last judge of Israel, and the first great prophet of a new era. Samuel grew, led, judged, and guided the people, and Israel began to experience order again. But the people wanted something more. They looked at the other nations, saw their kings, their organized armies, their thrones and crowns, and decided, we want a king too. Even with Samuel warning them, even with God saying that the king would demand taxes, sons in the army, and daughters serving in the palace, Israel insisted, and God allowed it. Thus, the first king of Israel was chosen. Saul, a tall and impressive man. Samuel looked like a leader, but whose heart was divided. He won battles, was respected, and unified the tribes. But glory rose to his heart. He disobeyed God, ignored instructions, made impulsive decisions, and allowed pride to replace obedience. And when God rejected Saul as king, his spiritual choir broke. From that moment on, his life spiraled into jealousy, paranoia, and violence. Meanwhile, God was preparing somebody for, somewhat unlikely, a young shepherd, the youngest son of Jesse, who spent his days playing the harp and tending sheep. When Samuel saw David's older brother, he assumed he must be the chosen one. But God said, man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And so David, the boy forgotten in the field, was anointed as king while he still smelled of sheep's wool. David's story begins small, but it explodes into greatness when he faces the giant Goliath. While all Israel trembled before that towering, arrogant Philistine, David stepped forward, moved not by human courage, but by trust in God. One stone, one sling, one silent prayer, and the giant fell. From that moment on, David became a name that echoed through all Israel. Saul began to hate him, but the people loved him. David spent years fleeing. He lived in caves, hid in the desert, was hunted like a criminal, even though he was God's anointed. But he never lifted a hand against Saul, never sought revenge, never used an opportunity to seize the throne. He waited, and when Saul finally fell in battle, David took his rightful place, the place God had reserved for him since youth. As king, David conquered Jerusalem, brought the Ark of the Covenant, unified the tribes, won wars, and established Israel as a powerful and feared nation. But even great men commit great sins. David fell into adultery with Bathsheba and tried to hide his guilt. The prophet Nathan confronted him, and David wept, repented, and returned to God. Even forgiven, he suffered consequences, family conflicts, rebellions, deep sorrow. Still, David became the greatest king of Israel, the man after God's own heart, the one who wrote psalms that would echo for centuries. After him, his son Solomon took the throne. Solomon was wise, so wise that his fame spread beyond borders. He built the temple, brought prosperity, formed alliances. Israel reached its peak. But even wisdom cannot prevent the human heart from corruption. In time, Solomon drifted, allowed idols, and let foreign influences shape his heart. And when he died, his shadow was no longer as bright as his early brilliance. After his death, the kingdom split. Israel to the north, Judah to the south. Two kingdoms, two thrones, two parallel stories, often repeating the same mistake, forgetting God. Most northern kings were wicked, idolatry, corruption, violence. The southern kings alternated between good and evil, but gradually drifted away as well. God sent prophets, many prophets, men who spoke with courage in a time when hearing the truth was dangerous. Elijah confronted Ahab and Jezebel, prayed for drought, faced the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, saw fire fall from heaven, and proved that the Lord is God. Elijah performed miracles, healed the sick, freed the oppressed, multiplied the oil, resurrected children, and showed that God was still among the people, even when they acted as though he didn't exist. Isaiah proclaimed the coming Messiah. Jeremiah wept for the nation. Ezekiel saw extraordinary visions. Daniel remained faithful in Babylon, was thrown into the lion's den, and witnessed dreams of kingdoms rising and falling. But the prophet's words were often ignored. The people hardened their hearts, and then judgment came. First, the northern kingdom fell to Assyria. Then the southern kingdom was taken into exile. In Babylon, Jerusalem was invaded. The temple burned. The walls collapsed. The city became ashes. And the people who once walked freely through the promised land were now chained and led to a foreign nation. In exile, God still spoke, still revealed, still corrected and restored. Daniel became an advisor to pagan kings. Ezekiel saw God's glory move. Stories of faithfulness shone like sparks in the darkness. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. Daniel in the lion's den. The people recognizing that even far from their land, God was still present. After 70 years, just as Jeremiah had prophesied, God opened the way home. King Cyrus of Persia allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem. Zerubbabel rebuilt the temple. Ezra restored the law. Nehemiah rebuilt the walls. And the people, broken and repentant, returned to the Lord's ways. Yet even with the physical restoration, something was still missing. The temple no longer had its former glory. The people felt the promise was still incomplete. The prophets Haggai and Zechariah called them back to faithfulness, reminding them that God would fulfill his word. Malachi, the last prophet of the Old Testament, spoke of the messenger who would prepare the way. And then, silence. 400 years of silence. 400 years without a prophet. 400 years of Velation. 400 years of Velation. 400 years of Velation. 400 years of error. And in the heart of a people who had survived wars, exile, persecution, and division, one promise remained. The promise of the one who would crush the serpent's head. The promise of the one who would come from the line of Abraham, from the house of David. The promise of the Messiah. The Old Testament ends with this expectation, with this breath held in suspense, with this burning hope for something greater, with something final, with something eberhardy. You know, the silence was finally broken, and the promise became flesh. When light shone again, the world would be ready for the New Testament. And so we reach the end of this extraordinary journey. The story of the Old Testament is not just a collection of ancient books. It is the path that prepares the stage for the greatest acte humana story. It is a map showing how God works through imperfect people, impossible circumstances, and promises to span generations. It is proof that even when humanity loses its way, God continues to find paths to redemption. Join us and continue walking through the origins of faith. See you in the next chapter.